Joining me now to look at the Ontario budget and the possible repercussions are Robert Benzie. He is the Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Laura Stone is a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Both of you, welcome on this very busy day. I want to start with what stands out for you in this budget. Let's start with you, Robert.
Well, I think the biggest thing was that there's a sense that that a Conservative government in Ontario is willing to be awash in red ink for the rest of the decade. I mean, they're really not projecting to balance the books until 2029-30, which is 2 elections away from now. So there are fiscal conservatives in this party who will not be happy about that.
Okay, Laura, what stands out for you?
Well, I think so as well. The degree to which this government is spending and for how long. They're not in a rush to get those deficits under control. And for someone who's known as a fiscal hawk, like Finance Minister Peter Beslan-Falvey, I think that must be very, very difficult for him. I mean, this is the reason why he got into politics. But here we have the government spending billions and billions of dollars on everything from hospitals to long-term care. And so clearly this government has had to pivot very quickly and very dramatically from what they were elected to do and really change the front that they present to the public as a result of this pandemic.
It's interesting because I think we're hearing the echoes of that across the country with the Alberta governments, the Saskatchewan governments, a lot of other governments of Conservative stripe, and they, as you say, use the term pivot, Laura, having to adapt to this pandemic reality. I want to look at something that was watched for a lot in Ontario, but also outside of the borders. That is, people were wondering whether the Conservative government of Doug Ford was going to bring in this much requested provincial paid sick leave. The feds offered some money for that. We didn't see it. Robert.
Yeah, I mean, that was a surprise in the sense that they had telegraphed a little bit that they might move on it. They were taking a lot of heat, but they're not going to supplement the federal program, which pays $500 a week, actually $450 after they take $50 off in taxes. There's been a lot of pressure on the Tories here to bolster that program because, the problem with paid sick leave is that if you don't have it, people are going to work. And if they have COVID-19 and they have to go to work to get paid, you're going to spread COVID-19. But the Tories did not move on that. And I think they're going to continue to face some political questions from their critics in the Liberals and the New Democrats and the Greens for not acting.
I was going to say, Laura, what do you make of that? I mean, are they going to pay a cost to that? Because that was one of the things that all of our eyes have been open to the need for as generous and easily accessible as possible paid sick leave.
I think that the government here erred on the side of the business community. This is not something that small businesses, for instance, would have supported, or most of them. We know that there are some who did, especially if it was the government that would be paying for it. But I think you did see this government make some very pro-business moves in terms of investing in testing and contact tracing, for instance. I think that is really called on by the business community in order to reopen the economy and to use some of these rapid tests and other initiatives to breed confidence in our healthcare capacity and to get that economy back open. I'm not surprised that they didn't move on sick pay. They have just resisted it every step of the way. And Premier Ford himself has called it double dipping with that federal program. But I do think that was a nod to business owners and business community that they were not going to do that.
Okay, one of the things across the country that we've been watching, and obviously that has been the tragedy of long-term care homes and the costs that we've suffered in terms of losses of Canadians in long-term care homes. There's been pressure from the federal government and pressure for the federal government to intervene. It's not to date. The Ontario government, the Ford government, says it's addressing the decline and it's turning around the decline and the crisis in long-term care. Robert.
Well, they're promising to build 30,000 long-term care beds in publicly controlled long-term care homes because a lot of the problems have been in privately owned homes here in Ontario. And remember, about 57% of Ontario's 7,200 deaths have been in long-term care homes from COVID-19. So there's been a lot of pressure on that. Peter Beslan-Falvey today reminded the legislature that the previous Liberal government in its last term only built a few hundred beds, and they're promising 30,000. But that's still a very small amount compared to the demand.
Laura, anything else you're watching for? I mean, I was going to say that both of you said that this is a conservative government, the Ford government, but which has accepted that it's going to be until the end of the decade that they'll be dealing with it before the budget's balanced. But at the same time, we heard some people praising the government, saying, well, compared to Alberta and maybe even what we'll see in the federal government, they're at least they have a roadmap, that there is a date for when the books will be balanced.
They do, and I suspect that next year, before the provincial budget, things are going to look a lot rosier. And if I was in the government's position, I would want to, to seem a little less optimistic this year and a lot more optimistic next year. But we still have criticisms from the opposition parties that the government is not investing enough in long-term programs such as education. We don't see a big boost to spending here, and we've heard the government talk a big game about women in the workforce, the she session of this pandemic, but we don't see a lot of major policy moves in order to address that.
There were some reports in some quarters suggesting that the government might have moved forward a bit more. You talk about women in the workforce in the she session. Robert, there were some suggestions that the government might have been interested in boosting childcare, increasing childcare programs.
Yeah, Peter Bethlenfalvy's former chief of staff wrote an op-ed in my newspaper earlier this week that said that had people like Laura and me thinking, well, maybe they're going to do something. Talking about universal childcare. Of course, there was nothing of the sort in the legislature, in the budget rather, about this. In fact, the only thing they really did was boost a tax credit for the so-called CARE credit has been boosted temporarily by 20%. So it's a few $100s that parents can apply toward their child care. There is a baby bonus check, though, in this. Every family with a kid up to grade 12 will get $400. And it used to be a $200 check and only until age 12. So they've expanded that program, the baby bonus program, for another year.
In terms of social or health spending, did the Ford government find anywhere to cut?
Well, that depends who you ask.
Yeah.
The NDP is accusing them. The NDP is accusing them of making cuts because program spending will decline next year, but that includes COVID spending. So, I think the public knows that these kinds of billions of dollars of boosts in COVID type initiatives are not permanent spending, but we also know that this pandemic is not over and that there are going to be lingering effects from it. So, the opposition parties are often criticizing the government for not increasing, health or education spending in line with inflation. And I think we're going to hear a lot from both the Liberals and the Conservatives along those lines, that the government is not investing enough in long-term infrastructure for those very important programs.
Robert, in the last 10 seconds, how do you think this will be remembered then? How will this be weighed out, this budget?
Well, I mean, Laura's right. I mean, there's an election in Ontario next year, so they're really going to have to figure out a theme for what that's going to be. I mean, I understand they're spending money like it's just been invented because they have to spend the money because of the pandemic, but they're really going to have to figure out what the narrative they take to the public is in next year's election. Okay.
Well, listen, both of you, I want to thank you for weighing in and helping us out, helping us through this on a very busy day filing. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much.